The yellowed pages of Dr. Samuel Whitmore's journal were discovered in 1987, sealed within a copper box buried beneath the foundation of what had once been the Calvary Medical Institute in eastern Texas. The leather-bound volume, dated between March and September of 1899, contained detailed observations of events that challenged the very foundations of medical understanding. Each entry was written in the physician's precise handwriting, documenting phenomena that defied rational explanation. Dr. Whitmore had arrived in the remote settlement of Millhaven during the harsh winter of 1898, commissioned by the State Medical Board to investigate reports of unusual deaths plaguing the isolated community. The town, nestled between dense pine forests and meandering creeks, had existed in relative obscurity since its founding in 1847. Local authorities had grown increasingly concerned about a pattern of fatalities that seemed to follow no known disease progression. The physician's initial entries described a community gripped by an atmosphere of profound unease, where residents spoke in hushed tones about matters they refused to fully explain. Children were kept indoors after sunset, and the local church had ceased holding evening services without official explanation. Even the town's livestock appeared restless, often refusing to graze in certain areas that had previously been their preferred feeding grounds. Whitmore's medical training at Harvard had prepared him for frontier challenges, but nothing in his education had equipped him to understand the peculiar symptoms he began documenting. Patients exhibited signs of extreme exhaustion, despite claiming to sleep soundly through the night. Their eyes bore a distant quality, as if they were perpetually listening to sounds that others could not hear. The local physician, Dr. Marcus Thornfield, had practiced in Millhaven for over 2 decades before Whitmore's arrival. Thornfield's own records, which he reluctantly shared with his colleague, revealed a troubling pattern that had emerged gradually over the previous 18 months. The deaths were not clustered in time or location, yet they shared characteristics that defied medical classification. Each victim had been discovered in their own bed, appearing peaceful as if they had simply failed to wake from natural sleep. Post-mortem examinations revealed no obvious cause of death, no signs of violence or disease. The bodies showed no rigor mortis, remaining supple for days after death in a manner that contradicted all known medical understanding. What disturbed Thornfield most profoundly was the expression found on each victim's face, a look of profound serenity mixed with what could only be described as anticipation. Their hands were invariably positioned over their hearts, fingers interlaced in a manner that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural positioning during sleep. The town's undertaker, a weathered man named Ezekiel Morse, had grown increasingly reluctant to discuss his observations with anyone outside his immediate family. When pressed by Whitmore, Morse admitted that the bodies required no preservation techniques, remaining unchanged for weeks without showing signs of decay. This phenomenon had begun to attract attention from neighboring communities, though few dared to speak openly about such matters. Local folklore, passed down through generations of settlers, spoke of ancient practices that predated European arrival in the region. The indigenous peoples who had once inhabited these lands were said to have conducted ceremonies in the deep woods, rituals that honored forces beyond human comprehension. These stories were typically dismissed as superstition, yet recent events had given them renewed significance. Whitmore's scientific mind initially rejected such explanations, seeking instead to identify environmental factors that might account for the unusual circumstances. He tested the local water supply, examined soil samples, and investigated potential exposure to unknown toxins. Each test yielded results within normal parameters, offering no rational explanation for the phenomena he was documenting. The physician's frustration grew as he realized that conventional medical knowledge provided no framework for understanding what was occurring in Millhaven. His journal entries began to reflect a growing sense that he was confronting something that existed beyond the boundaries of accepted scientific understanding. As winter gave way to spring, Whitmore noticed that the frequency of unusual deaths had begun to increase, following a pattern that seemed to correlate with the lunar cycle. This observation would prove to be the first piece of a puzzle that would ultimately challenge everything he believed about the nature of life and death. By early April, Dr. Whitmore had documented 17 deaths that followed the inexplicable pattern he had begun to recognize. His meticulous records revealed that each fatality occurred during the 3 nights surrounding the new moon, when darkness was most complete. The victims ranged in age from 23 to 67, representing various occupations and social standings within the community. What struck the physician as particularly significant was the apparent randomness of victim selection. Yet upon closer examination, subtle connections began to emerge. Each individual had been born in Millhaven or had resided in the community for at least 15 years. None were recent arrivals, suggesting that whatever force was at work required deep roots within the local population. The victims' families displayed a peculiar reaction to their losses that troubled Whitmore deeply. Rather than expressing the grief and confusion he expected, relatives seemed to accept the deaths with a resignation that bordered on expectation. When questioned about their loved ones' final days, family members consistently reported that the deceased had seemed unusually peaceful and content. Dr. Thornfield's records revealed that this pattern had actually begun much earlier than initially suspected, with isolated cases dating back nearly 5 years. The veteran physician had initially attributed these deaths to natural causes, but the increasing frequency had forced him to acknowledge that something unprecedented was occurring in his community. Local religious leaders had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, though they seemed reluctant to discuss their concerns openly. Reverend Jonathan Hayes, who had served the community's Methodist congregation for 12 years, had begun conducting private consultations with affected families. His own journal, later discovered among church records, revealed his growing conviction that the deaths were connected to spiritual forces. The town's Catholic priest, Father Miguel Santos, had arrived in Millhaven only 6 months before Whitmore, sent by his diocese to minister to the growing Hispanic population in the region. Santos had immediately sensed something unsettling about the community, noting in his correspondence with church authorities that the local atmosphere felt heavy with unspoken knowledge. So Whitmore's attempts to interview long-term residents about local history met with consistent evasion and discomfort. Elderly townspeople would begin to share memories of earlier times, only to suddenly change the subject when their recollections approached certain topics. The physician began to suspect that the community harbored secrets that predated the current crisis. The town's founding families, whose ancestors had established Millhaven in the 1840s, seemed particularly reluctant to discuss the area's history. These families, the Blackwoods, Ashfords, and Merriweathers, had intermarried extensively over the generations, creating a tight-knit network that controlled much of the local commerce and political influence. Whitmore's investigation led him to the town's small library, housed in a converted residence that contained records dating back to the community's establishment. The librarian, Miss Eleanor Ashford, was a spinster in her 50s who had devoted her life to preserving local history. Her knowledge of community records was encyclopedic, yet she too seemed to guard certain information carefully. Among the historical documents, Whitmore discovered references to unusual events that had occurred periodically throughout Millhaven's history. These incidents were recorded in euphemistic language that suggested the writers were deliberately obscuring the true nature of what they had witnessed. Terms like "mass the calling" and "mass the gathering" appeared repeatedly without clear explanation. The physician's medical training had taught him to look for patterns in seemingly unrelated symptoms, and he began to apply this methodology to the historical records. What emerged was a cycle of unexplained events that occurred roughly every 7 to 10 years. always during periods when the community faced particular challenges or transitions. The most detailed account came from a diary kept by Sarah Blackwood in 1867 during the difficult years following the Civil War. Her entries described a time when the community had faced severe hardships, including crop failures and economic uncertainty. It was during this period that the first recorded instances of the peaceful deaths had occurred, bringing what Sarah described as a restoration of balance. Dr. Marcus Thornfield's demeanor had grown increasingly strained as spring progressed into early summer. Whitmore observed his colleague's deteriorating condition with growing concern, noting the older physician's trembling hands and hollow-eyed appearance. Thornfield had begun avoiding their regular consultations, claiming urgent matters that required his immediate attention elsewhere in the community. The breaking point came on a humid evening in late June, when Thornfield appeared unexpectedly at Whitmore's temporary residence near the town center. The veteran physician's appearance was disheveled, his usually immaculate clothing wrinkled and stained. His eyes held a desperate quality that suggested a man wrestling with unbearable knowledge. Without preamble, Thornfield began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid that others might overhear his words. He revealed that his understanding of the deaths extended far beyond what he had previously admitted. For over 20 years, he had been documenting not just the fatalities, but the circumstances that preceded them. The older physician's records, hidden in a locked cabinet in his private study, contained detailed observations of behavioral changes that occurred in victims during the weeks before their deaths. These individuals began experiencing vivid dreams that they described as calling dreams, visions that filled them with profound sense of purpose and anticipation. Thornfield's voice grew more agitated as he described how these dreams seemed to provide the victims with knowledge they could not have possessed through normal means. They spoke of places they had never visited, people they had never met, and events that had occurred before their birth. This knowledge appeared to center around the history of the land itself, reaching back to times before European settlement. The physician's investigation had led him to discover that the indigenous peoples who had originally inhabited the region had considered this area sacred, a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was particularly thin. Their oral traditions spoke of ceremonies conducted to maintain harmony between these realms, rituals that required willing participation from those chosen by spiritual forces. Thornfield's research had uncovered evidence that the early European settlers had encountered remnants of these indigenous practices, initially attempting to suppress them through force and religious conversion. However, as the community faced various crises over the decades, some settlers had begun to understand that these ancient practices served a purpose that transcended their religious prejudices. The physician revealed that certain families in Millhaven had maintained knowledge of these traditions across generations, passing down understanding through carefully guarded oral histories. These families had come to recognize that the peaceful deaths were not random tragedies, but rather a continuation of ancient practices that maintained spiritual balance in the region. Thornfield's voice broke as he admitted that his own family had been among those entrusted with this knowledge. His grandfather had been present during the community's first encounter with the phenomenon in 1852, when a series of unexplained deaths had coincided with the end of a devastating drought that had threatened the settlement's survival. The older physician described how each generation had struggled with the moral implications of their knowledge, torn between their desire to prevent the deaths and their growing understanding that interference might bring even greater catastrophe. The deaths, while tragic, seemed to serve as a form of spiritual taxation, maintaining harmony between the community and forces beyond human comprehension. As Thornfield's confession continued, he revealed that the victims were not chosen randomly, but rather selected through a process that remained mysterious even to those who understood its general purpose. The chosen individuals began experiencing the calling dreams approximately 1 month before their deaths, during which time they gradually came to accept and even embrace their fate. The physician's hands shook violently as he described his growing realization that his own dreams had begun to change in recent weeks. The familiar patterns of sleep had given way to visions that felt more real than waking life. Dreams that filled him with a strange mixture of terror and profound peace. Thornfield's final words before departing that evening would haunt Whitmore for the remainder of his time in Millhaven. The older physician looked directly into his colleague's eyes and whispered that some knowledge carried a price that could only be paid through participation, and that understanding the truth about the deaths meant accepting the possibility of joining them. Miss Eleanor Ashford's invitation to examine the library's restricted archives came 3 days after Thornfield's disturbing confession. The librarian's manner had changed noticeably since Whitmore's arrival in Millhaven, evolving from polite assistance to something approaching conspiratorial collaboration. Her pale blue eyes now held an intensity that suggested she had reached some internal decision about the physician's trustworthiness. The restricted section was housed in the library's basement, accessible only through a narrow staircase hidden behind a false wall of bookshelves. The air below ground was thick with the scent of aged paper and something else, a sweet, earthy odor that Whitmore could not identify. Candles provided the only illumination, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with documents that predated the town's official founding. Eleanor's voice took on a reverent quality as she explained that these archives contained the true history of the region, records that had been deliberately excluded from official documentation. The earliest entries were written in languages that reflected the area's diverse heritage, Spanish, French, and indigenous scripts that had been translated by scholars who understood their significance. The most significant collection consisted of documents compiled by Father Esteban Morales, a Spanish missionary who had worked among the indigenous peoples during the late 18th century. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Morales had approached native spiritual practices with curiosity rather than condemnation, documenting rituals and beliefs with remarkable detail and respect. Morales' writings described ceremonies conducted at specific locations throughout the region, sites where the indigenous peoples believed the spirit world intersected with physical reality. These locations were marked by natural features, unusual rock formations, springs that flowed year-round, and groves of trees that grew in perfect circles. The missionary had mapped these sites with precision that suggested he understood their importance. The priest's most detailed accounts focused on rituals conducted during times of community crisis, ceremonies designed to restore balance between the human and spiritual realms. These practices required voluntary participation from individuals who had been selected through dreams and visions, people who willingly offered themselves to maintain harmony for their community. Eleanor's fingers traced the faded ink as she translated passages that described the selection process in detail. The chosen individuals experienced a gradual transformation over several weeks, during which they gained access to knowledge and understanding that transcended normal human experience. This process culminated in a peaceful transition that the indigenous peoples viewed as a form of spiritual elevation rather than death. The archives contained extensive correspondence between early European settlers and church authorities, revealing the complex negotiations that had occurred as two very different worldviews encountered each other. Some settlers had initially attempted to suppress indigenous practices through force, but repeated failures and mounting crises had forced them to reconsider their approach. A particularly significant collection of letters written by town founder Jeremiah Blackwood between 1847 and 1851, documented his gradual acceptance of indigenous spiritual practices after conventional solutions had failed to address mounting community problems. Blackwood's transformation from skeptical pioneer to reluctant participant in ancient rituals provided a template that subsequent generations had followed. The archives revealed that the peaceful deaths had been occurring regularly since the town's establishment, always during periods when the community faced significant challenges. The pattern suggested that these deaths served as a form of spiritual intervention, providing solutions to problems that could not be resolved through conventional means. Eleanor's voice grew softer as she shared documents that revealed her own family's role in maintaining these traditions. The Ashfords had served as record keepers for over 50 years, documenting each occurrence and preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost. This responsibility had been passed down through generations of women who understood the weight of their guardianship. The librarian's hands trembled slightly as she opened a leather portfolio containing the most recent additions to the collection. These documents, written in her own careful script, detailed the current cycle of deaths and the circumstances that had precipitated them. The community was facing challenges that threatened its very survival, and the ancient forces were responding as they had for generations. As the evening progressed, Eleanor revealed that the archives contained not just historical records, but also detailed instructions for those who might need to participate in the ancient practices. These documents had been prepared by previous generations, who understood that knowledge without guidance could prove dangerous for both individuals and the community as a whole. Dr. Whitmore's sleep patterns began to change during the first week of July, subtle alterations that initially seemed attributable to the oppressive summer heat and his growing anxiety about the situation in Millhaven. His dreams, typically fragmented and quickly forgotten, became increasingly vivid and coherent, featuring landscapes and scenarios that felt more substantial than his waking experiences. The first significant dream occurred on a moonless night when the air hung still and heavy with approaching storm clouds. Whitmore found himself standing in a forest clearing that he had never visited, yet somehow recognized with perfect familiarity. Ancient trees formed a perfect circle around a natural depression in the earth, their branches intertwining overhead to create a living cathedral. Within the clearing, figures moved with purposeful grace, their faces obscured by shadows despite the strange luminescence that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. These beings appeared to be conducting some form of ceremony, their movements synchronized in patterns that suggested deep spiritual significance. Whitmore felt drawn to join them, though he remained frozen at the clearing's edge. The dream figures turned toward him with expressions of welcome and recognition, as if they had been expecting his arrival. Without speaking, they conveyed understanding that transcended language, sharing knowledge about the nature of existence that challenged everything he had learned through medical training. The boundary between life and death, they suggested, was far more permeable than conventional wisdom acknowledged. Upon waking, Whitmore found that the dream's impact lingered throughout the following day, influencing his thoughts and perceptions in ways that felt both unsettling and strangely comforting. The vivid imagery remained accessible to his conscious mind, unlike typical dreams that faded within hours. He began documenting these experiences in his journal, noting their increasing frequency and intensity. The second calling dream occurred 3 nights later, transporting him to the same forest clearing, but revealing additional details that had been obscured during his initial visit. The ceremony he witnessed appeared to be a form of communion between the living and the dead, with participants from both realms sharing knowledge and energy in ways that defied rational explanation. Whitmore observed that some of the figures in his dreams bore resemblance to individuals he had encountered in Millhaven, though their appearances were somehow elevated or transformed. These dream versions of townspeople moved with confidence and serenity that contrasted sharply with their waking counterparts, anxiety and fear. The transformation suggested that participation in the ceremony brought profound peace and understanding. As the dreams continued, Whitmore began to recognize that he was not merely observing these ceremonies, but was being gradually prepared for participation. The dream figures provided instruction in spiritual practices that had no equivalent in his medical training, teaching him to perceive reality through expanded awareness that encompassed both physical and metaphysical dimensions. The physician's rational mind struggled to accept the implications of these experiences, yet he could not deny their profound impact on his understanding of the situation in Millhaven. The dreams provided context for the peaceful deaths that no amount of medical investigation had been able to supply, revealing them as voluntary transitions rather than tragic losses. During his fifth calling dream, Whitmore encountered Dr. Thornfield among the ceremony participants, though his colleague appeared transformed by an inner light that suggested profound spiritual development. Dream Thornfield communicated without words, sharing understanding about the physician's role in maintaining balance between the human and spiritual communities. The dreams revealed that Whitmore's arrival in Millhaven had not been coincidental, but rather part of a larger pattern that connected him to the ancient practices through bloodlines he had never known existed. His maternal grandmother, he learned, had been born in this region before her family's migration to Massachusetts, carrying genetic memory that made him susceptible to the calling. As July progressed, the boundary between Whitmore's dream experiences and waking consciousness began to blur in ways that both terrified and exhilarated him. The knowledge gained during sleep remained accessible throughout the day, providing insights into medical cases that conventional training could not explain. His understanding of life and death expanded beyond anything he had previously imagined possible. The calling dreams also revealed the approaching culmination of the current cycle, a ceremony that would require willing participation from those who had been selected through the dream process. Whitmore understood that his choice to participate or resist would have consequences that extended far beyond his individual fate, affecting the entire community's spiritual balance. The revelation of Millhaven's deepest secret came through a series of carefully orchestrated encounters that suggested the community's leadership had been monitoring Whitmore's progress toward understanding. These meetings, arranged by Eleanor Ashford with the discretion of a practiced conspirator, brought together individuals who had maintained the ancient knowledge across multiple generations. The first gathering took place in the basement of the Blackwood family's general store, a space that had served as an unofficial meeting place for the community's inner circle since the town's founding. Present were representatives from each of the founding families, along with several newer residents who had been gradually inducted into the circle of knowledge over the years. Thomas Blackwood, great-grandson of the town's founder, served as the group's unofficial leader, his weathered face bearing the weight of inherited responsibility. His voice carried the authority of generations as he explained that the community had reached a critical juncture that required full disclosure to someone with Whitmore's medical expertise and growing spiritual awareness. The gathering revealed that Millhaven's prosperity and survival over the decades had been directly connected to the community's participation in the ancient practices. During periods when the ceremonies had been neglected or interrupted, the town had faced disasters that threatened its very existence. Crop failures, disease outbreaks, and economic collapses that had been resolved only through renewed spiritual cooperation. Sarah Merriweather, the town's eldest resident at 83D, shared memories passed down from her grandmother about the community's early struggles with the indigenous spiritual practices. The first European settlers had initially viewed these rituals as pagan superstition, attempting to suppress them through force and religious conversion, only to discover that such interference brought catastrophic consequences. The turning point had come during the severe drought of 1852, when conventional solutions had failed to address the crisis threatening the community's survival. Jeremiah Blackwood, facing the prospect of abandoning the settlement, had reluctantly agreed to participate in a ceremony conducted by the few remaining indigenous spiritual leaders in the region. The ceremony had required the voluntary participation of 7 community members who had experienced calling dreams, individuals who willingly offered themselves to restore balance between the human and spiritual realms. Their peaceful deaths had coincided with the breaking of the drought and the beginning of a period of unprecedented prosperity for the settlement. Subsequent generations had maintained this arrangement through carefully preserved knowledge and selective participation, understanding that the ancient practices required ongoing commitment rather than occasional intervention. The community had developed elaborate systems for identifying and supporting those who experienced calling dreams, ensuring that the spiritual obligations were met with dignity and respect. The group's records revealed that the current cycle of deaths represented the most significant spiritual intervention in over 30 years, suggesting that the community faced challenges that required extraordinary measures. Economic pressures, changing social conditions, and the gradual erosion of traditional values had created imbalances that could only be addressed through renewed spiritual cooperation. Whitmore learned that his own calling dreams had been anticipated by the community's spiritual advisors, who had recognized signs indicating that outside assistance would be required for the current ceremony. His medical training and growing spiritual awareness made him uniquely qualified to serve as a bridge between conventional understanding and ancient wisdom. The physician's role, the gathering explained, would involve documenting the ceremony with scientific precision while participating in its spiritual dimensions. This dual perspective would create a record that future generations could use to understand and maintain the practices that ensured the community's continued survival and prosperity. The meeting concluded with the presentation of a leather-bound volume containing detailed instructions for the upcoming ceremony, along with personal accounts from previous participants who had documented their experiences for posterity. These writings revealed that the transition from life to death during the ceremony was experienced as a form of spiritual elevation rather than termination. As the gathering dispersed, each member approached Whitmore individually to share personal perspectives on the responsibility he was being asked to accept. Their words carried the weight of generations who had grappled with the moral implications of the ancient practices, understanding that survival sometimes required sacrifices that challenged conventional ethical frameworks. The final weeks of July brought an atmosphere of solemn preparation to Millhaven as the community quietly readied itself for the ceremony that would conclude the current cycle of spiritual intervention. Whitmore observed subtle changes in the townspeople's behavior, a heightened awareness and reverence that suggested they understood the significance of approaching events. Dr. Thornfield's condition had stabilized into a state of peaceful acceptance that contrasted sharply with his earlier agitation. The older physician spent his days putting his affairs in order with methodical precision, ensuring that his medical practice could continue serving the community after his participation in the ceremony. His transformation from fearful resistance to serene compliance illustrated the profound psychological changes that accompanied the calling dreams. The other selected participants, 5 additional community members who had experienced the calling dreams, displayed similar patterns of acceptance and preparation. These individuals, ranging in age from 28 to 64, came from various backgrounds and social positions within the community, their selection apparently based on spiritual rather than social criteria. Eleanor Ashford had taken responsibility for preparing the ceremonial site, a natural clearing deep within the forest that had been used for such purposes since before European settlement. Her knowledge of the required preparations came from detailed instructions preserved in the archives, combined with guidance received through her own dreams as the ceremony approached. The clearing required specific modifications to serve its spiritual purpose, including the placement of stones in patterns that corresponded to celestial alignments and the preparation of natural materials that would facilitate communication between the physical and spiritual realms. These preparations were conducted with reverent precision, following traditions that had been maintained for generations. Whitmore's role in the ceremony required him to master techniques that bridged his medical training with spiritual practices that had no equivalent in conventional education. He learned to perceive vital signs and consciousness states that existed beyond the boundaries of normal medical understanding, preparing to document phenomena that challenged accepted scientific paradigms. The physician's preparation also involved fasting and meditation practices designed to heighten his spiritual sensitivity while maintaining the analytical clarity necessary for accurate documentation. This balance between spiritual participation and scientific observation represented a unique challenge that required careful calibration of his mental and physical state. The community's support for the selected participants took forms that reflected generations of experience with such ceremonies. Families and friends provided practical assistance while maintaining emotional distance that would ease the transition for all involved. This delicate balance between care and detachment demonstrated the community's sophisticated understanding of the psychological dynamics involved. As the ceremony date approached, Whitmore began experiencing physical sensations that accompanied his spiritual preparation. Heightened awareness of natural rhythms, increased sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, and perception of energy patterns that seemed to connect all living things. These changes suggested that his consciousness was expanding to accommodate awareness that transcended normal human limitations. The selected participants gathered regularly during the final week to share their experiences and provide mutual support as they prepared for their transition. These meetings revealed that each individual's calling dreams had provided unique insights into the spiritual dimensions of existence, creating a collective understanding that was greater than the sum of its parts. The community's children were gradually prepared for the upcoming ceremony through age-appropriate explanations that emphasized the honor and significance of the participants' sacrifice. This educational process ensured that future generations would understand and respect the traditions that maintained their community's spiritual balance. Local religious leaders had developed special services that honored the ceremony participants while maintaining consistency with Christian teachings that most community members followed. This integration of indigenous spiritual practices with European religious traditions demonstrated the sophisticated theological framework that had evolved over generations of cultural synthesis. The ceremony commenced at midnight on the new moon of August, when darkness was most complete and the boundary between physical and spiritual realms was thinnest. Whitmore approached the forest clearing with a mixture of scientific curiosity and spiritual reverence, carrying instruments that would document phenomena beyond conventional medical understanding. The natural amphitheater had been transformed through careful preparation into a sacred space that seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy. Stones arranged in precise geometric patterns created focal points for spiritual forces, while carefully tended fires provided illumination that revealed rather than obscured the ceremony's mystical dimensions. The 6 selected participants entered the clearing with serene dignity, their faces reflecting the profound peace that had characterized their final weeks of preparation. Dr. Thornfield moved with particular grace, his earlier fears replaced by understanding that transcended rational explanation. Each participant took their designated position within the stone circle with perfect knowledge of their role. Whitmore positioned himself at the clearing's edge, where he could observe and document the proceedings while remaining connected to the ceremony's spiritual currents. His medical instruments registered phenomena that challenged everything he had learned about the nature of life and consciousness. Energy patterns that suggested awareness existed independently of physical form. The ceremony began with invocations spoken in languages that predated European settlement, words that seemed to resonate with the natural environment itself. The forest responded to these ancient syllables with subtle changes in atmosphere and energy that Whitmore's instruments detected but could not adequately measure or explain. As the ritual progressed, the participants entered states of consciousness that appeared to bridge the gap between life and death, their vital signs fluctuating in patterns that defied medical explanation. Whitmore observed their peaceful transitions with growing understanding that death, as conventionally understood, represented only one phase of a larger spiritual journey. The ceremony's climax occurred as dawn approached, when the participants achieved complete unity with the spiritual forces that had called them. Their physical forms remained in the clearing, appearing to sleep peacefully, while their consciousness joined the eternal ceremony that maintained balance between all realms of existence. Whitmore's documentation of these final moments revealed phenomena that would challenge medical science for generations to come. The participants' bodies showed no signs of trauma or disease, yet their life force had clearly departed for destinations beyond physical measurement. Their faces bore expressions of profound joy and fulfillment that suggested they had achieved something far greater than mere survival. The community members who had gathered at the clearing's perimeter maintained respectful silence as the ceremony concluded, their presence serving as witness to the sacrifice that ensured their continued prosperity and spiritual balance. Children stood beside their parents, learning through observation the traditions that would guide their own future decisions. As sunrise illuminated the clearing, Whitmore understood that he had witnessed something that transcended the boundaries between science and spirituality, life and death, individual sacrifice and community survival. His documentation would preserve knowledge of practices that maintained harmony between human communities and forces beyond conventional understanding. The ceremony's aftermath brought a sense of renewal to Millhaven that was immediately apparent in the changed atmosphere of the community. The oppressive tension that had characterized recent months was replaced by peaceful confidence that suggested the spiritual intervention had achieved its intended purpose. Whitmore's final journal entries, written in the days following the ceremony, reflected his transformed understanding of existence itself. The physician, who had arrived in Millhaven seeking rational explanations for unexplained deaths, departed with knowledge that challenged the very foundations of medical science and spiritual understanding, carrying responsibility for preserving wisdom that bridged multiple worlds of experience.